They say the Ozarks remember. Every scream, every lie, every name whispered before dawn. But what the earth remembers about Prudence Hoffman, the widow who watched her children die one by one in the spring of 1834, is something the county records were never meant to tell. Because what happened in Cedar Hollow was not simply a crime. It was a cleansing. And those who tried to erase it were part of something older than the state of Missouri itself. Cedar Hollow was a settlement carved out of wilderness, 40 families clinging to survival among the limestone bluffs and endless forests. By day, it looked like a portrait of frontier virtue, hard-working farmers, faithful congregants, neighbors bound by trust. But at night, beneath that thin layer of respectability, something moved. A hierarchy older than America itself, families who decided what sins could be forgiven and what secrets would be buried with the dead. Prudence Hoffman entered this world a widow, young, capable, and according to every account too intelligent for her place. Her husband Samuel had died of lung fever, leaving her with 3 boys and no protection in a land ruled by men who mistook charity for ownership. The Grimby farm supplied her with help, the Stokes family with provisions, and Reverend Corwin with spiritual guidance. But each gift came bound to invisible debt. Between March and September, all 3 of her sons died. Each death ruled an accident. Each funeral attended by the same dozen mourners. And yet, every time that bell rang, someone swore they saw the widow's face grow calmer, not more broken. What the records call misfortune, the surviving journals call a reckoning. Letters found years later describe meetings by lantern light in Reverend Corwin's cellar gatherings where men spoke of oaths, lineage, and purity of blood. And in those same letters, one name is written over and over in the Reverend's own hand. Prudence must not be allowed to remember. Tonight, we return to Cedar Hollow not as historians, but as witnesses. Because what happened there wasn't madness. It was design. By the end of spring 1834, Cedar Hollow had buried 3 children, all from the same family, all under the same roof. To outsiders, it looked like misfortune. To those who lived there, it felt like judgment. The first to die was Thomas, age 12. Neighbors said he slipped while fetching water from the creek, struck his head on the rocks, and drowned before help could reach him. But the coroner's notes, buried in an attic trunk a century later, describe something else. Bruising around the wrists, as if someone held him down. The second was Benjamin, found lifeless behind the barn, his neck at an unnatural angle. A fall from the hayloft, they said, but the ladder had only 3 rungs and no broken boards. And then came Isaac, the youngest, 6 years old, disappeared in the forest behind the Hoffman homestead. When they found him 2 days later, his body was unmarked. Only his eyes were open, fixed toward the ridge where the old meeting house stood. Prudence did not scream at the funerals. She did not cry. She stood like stone, hands folded, her gaze locked on the Reverend as he preached about divine will, and that silence unsettled Cedar Hollow more than any display of grief could have. Behind closed doors, whispers began to spread. Maritable Stokes called her unrepentant. Josiah Grimby claimed she had allowed darkness into her home. Others said she'd angered God by refusing Reverend Corwin's offer to remarry, an offer that had come only weeks after Samuel's death. But those same whispers avoided something else. That the Grimby sons had worked the Hoffman farm alone with Prudence's boys for weeks before the first death. That the Reverend had visited her cabin at night, under pretense of pastoral care. That Maritable Stokes had sent her medicine that no one could name, a dark syrup with the smell of iron. By midsummer, the widow was watched, her every move recorded in gossip and sermon. Yet in all the surviving journals, every entry, every letter, one thing repeats. She never spoke of revenge. She only waited. And then, as the leaves began to turn, waiting turned to action. 3 more deaths followed this time, adults. Each one tied to the circle of good Christians who had helped her bury her children. Each one found marked with the same symbol carved into the bark of the Hoffman oak. A circle split by a vertical line, like an eye forced open. To this day, no one knows what that mark meant. But old Ozark folklore speaks of a charm used by women in the frontier years, a sigil of exposure. A way to make hidden guilt visible to the one who invoked it. And in Cedar Hollow, guilt was about to be exposed in ways even the Reverend could not contain. By autumn, the line between faith and fear in Cedar Hollow had vanished. Every sermon rang like a threat, every prayer sounded like an accusation. And at the center of it all stood Reverend Silas Corwin, the man everyone trusted, until they realized how much of their trust he owned. Corwin was no simple preacher. He had come to the Ozarks from St. Louis, carrying letters of recommendation signed by men no one in Cedar Hollow had ever met, men connected to Missouri's early territorial government. His homilies blended scripture with warnings about purity, obedience, and the dangers of unclean blood. Most thought it was just another brand of frontier fire. But those who attended his private gatherings beneath the meeting house knew better. The cellar beneath the church was older than the town itself, a brick vault built by the region's first settlers. In that darkness, Corwin gathered a circle of men. Grimby, Stokes, and 6 others who represented every major family in the hollow. Their oath was simple: to preserve the order of the settlement. But the records found later tell a different story, one of ritual punishment disguised as divine duty. They believed sin could infect a community the way rot spreads through grain, that one impure soul could condemn an entire valley. And they believed Prudence Hoffman had become that contagion. The Reverend's journals, preserved in fragments, describe a woman marked by inheritance. He claimed her grandmother had practiced the folk craft of the old lands, herbalism, charms, healing with roots and symbols. To Corwin and his circle, that meant witchcraft. But the timing of his accusations is telling. They began only after Prudence refused to sell him her husband's land, the same land that sat above a vein of iron or the Reverend's allies were desperate to control. The first so-called accident occurred less than a week later. In public, Corwin preached forgiveness. In private, he spoke of purging. And when the 3 men who had enforced his will began dying, each found with that strange mark burned into wood near where they fell, the Reverend's sermons turned frantic. He told his congregation that evil hides behind sorrow, that the devil had taken a widow's grief and forged it into vengeance. But behind that pulpit rage, something else was unraveling. Witness accounts describe Corwin waking in the night, screaming that he'd seen faces at his window, that the forest itself whispered his name. His handwriting changed, jagged, uneven. In his final entries, he wrote only one phrase over and over again: "She remembers." By the time the first snow fell, the Reverend's confidence had collapsed into delirium. And the power that ruled Cedar Hollow, the secret order that decided who lived and who was erased, was about to learn what happens when their own sins refuse to stay buried. Long before Prudence Hoffman became a widow, before Cedar Hollow even had a name, this part of the Ozarks was known by another: the Hollow of Remembrance. The earliest maps drawn by French explorers in the late 1700s mark the ridge with a symbol, 2 circles intersecting, bisected by a vertical line. The same sign that later appeared carved into the oak outside the Hoffman cabin. No one could explain how a woman of the frontier, with no access to old records or foreign lore, could have known that mark. But Prudence had grown up in Pennsylvania. Raised by her grandmother, a woman whispered to have the gift. In those early letters she wrote to her husband, still preserved in the Hoffman estate archives, Prudence mentioned the remembering, a word she used to describe what others might call intuition. She believed memory could live not only in the mind, but in the land itself, that the earth held imprints of every injustice, and sometimes lent them to those strong enough to see. When her sons died, something in her changed. Neighbors said she no longer prayed with the others. Instead, she worked her fields by moonlight, barefoot, murmuring to the soil. They thought it madness. But what if it wasn't? What if the grief that hollowed her didn't destroy her, but connected her to something that had been waiting in silence beneath Cedar Hollow all along? It's said that on the night before the first adult death, that of Josiah Grimby, several settlers saw Prudence walking toward the meeting house carrying a lantern that did not flicker. Some claimed it burned blue. Others said it cast no shadow. Whatever they saw, Grimby was found the next morning at his gate, eyes wide open, skin cold, his chest marked with that same split-circle symbol. The townsfolk called it witchcraft. But when scholars examined those carvings in the 1920s, they noticed something remarkable. The geometry matched a sigil found in 17th-century alchemical texts used not for harm, but for revelation. His purpose wasn't to curse. It was to force truth into the open. That symbol wasn't vengeance. It was exposure. And that's when the deeper horror becomes clear, because Prudence Hoffman wasn't trying to kill the men who wronged her. She was trying to make the Hollow remember what they had done to her children, and to generations before her. By invoking that ancient sign, she awakened something older than the Reverend's order. Something the settlers built their church upon precisely to keep buried. Before we continue, pause and look around you. Ask yourself, what would the land remember if it could speak your name? And if you're still here, if you feel that pull, the sense that something beneath the surface has started watching, comment the phrase, "I remember the Hollow," twice below. Not just to mark that you've heard this far, but to claim the part of you that refuses to forget. Because after this point, we don't just tell the story. We enter it. By the first frost of 1834, the Hollow had begun to turn against itself. Not because of Prudence's defiance, but because her silence was no longer hers alone. The witnesses described it the same way. Dreams that bled into waking life. Men waking to find dirt under their fingernails, though they hadn't worked the fields. Women hearing children's laughter from empty rooms. The bell tower rang without a hand touching the rope. Something beneath Cedar Hollow had started to speak through the cracks. 3 members of Reverend Corwin's circle fell in quick succession. One was found hanging from the rafters of his barn, eyes open, lips bitten bloody. Another, drowned in a shallow pond no deeper than a man's knee. The third vanished entirely, leaving only a pile of clothes folded neatly beside the meeting house door. The settlement was gripped by terror, but no one dared flee. They feared the wilderness more than they feared the truth, and they feared that truth might follow them. Reverend Corwin began holding nightly vigils, his sermons collapsing into rants about the earth's rebellion against deceit. His followers scribbled notes that survive today in fragments, describing shadows gathering at the treeline, and a light in the widow's cabin that moved without flame. But here's what official history omits. Those same nights, Prudence Hoffman was seen in the forest, standing at the base of the great oak, hands pressed to its bark, lips moving as if in prayer. The next morning, villagers found symbols drawn in ash around the meeting house, 6 in total. 1 for each family in Corwin's order. Each mark pointed toward a buried crime. Hidden beneath the polished legacy of Cedar Hollow were stories of stolen land, vanished orphans, and rituals disguised as baptisms. The order that called itself Keepers of Purity had spent years erasing the evidence of their own corruption. And it was those memories, the ones they tried to bury, that the land itself began to surface. By then, even the loyal had begun to break. Maritable Stokes, the matron who'd once delivered food to Prudence, confessed before a congregation of 20 that she'd given the widow a tonic meant to quiet her womb, ordered by Reverend Corwin himself. She said she heard the Reverend's voice in her dreams afterward, whispering from under the floorboards. 2 days later, she was gone. Only the tonic bottle remained, half buried in her garden soil. When word reached the nearest magistrate, he sent an investigator, a young man from Springfield. His name appears once in the record, then never again. His horse was found wandering near the creek, saddle torn, hooves bloodstained. Cedar Hollow was left alone. No law, no salvation, just an entire valley learning what happens when lies are older than the land they're built on. They called it haunting. They called it madness. But the truth may be simpler. Cedar Hollow wasn't cursed. It was remembering. By late winter of 1834, only 7 families remained in Cedar Hollow. The rest had fled into the hills or vanished without a trace. But Reverend Corwin refused to leave. He said the Hollow was God's test and that he alone would survive it purified. On the night of February 3rd, he lit every candle in the meeting house and summoned Prudence Hoffman to stand before his flock. Witnesses described the air as unbreathable, thick with the smell of iron and smoke. The Reverend's voice trembled as he accused her of witchcraft, of murder, of consorting with the memory of the pit. But those who saw Prudence that night claimed she did not tremble. She walked barefoot down the aisle, her face pale, her eyes dark as the soil after rain, and in her hands, she carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she laid it before the pulpit, the congregation saw what it was. 3 river stones, smooth and black, each carved with the same symbol, the split circle. "Your God took my sons," she said quietly, "and now your God will see them again." Corwin roared scripture, striking the pulpit with his fist. But as he spoke, the candles guttered one by one. The congregation swore they saw shadows rise not from the walls, but from beneath the floorboards. The air turned cold enough to crack glass. Then Prudence spoke again, a single phrase repeated in the language her grandmother had taught her. "Let it remember." The meeting house doors slammed shut, and every bell in the valley began to ring. What happened next exists only in fragments. The surviving journal of a man named Elias Varn, one of Corwin's deacons, describes a sound like the ground itself splitting open. He wrote that the Reverend's voice broke into screams, and that Prudence's lantern light burned white before everything went silent. At dawn, the church still stood but blackened as if struck by lightning. Inside there were no bodies, only the pulpit, cracked down the middle, and 3 stones resting upon it. The next week, snow fell heavier than any in living memory. The valley was sealed. By spring, Cedar Hollow was abandoned. Locals who returned years later said no grass would grow near the meeting house, and no bird would nest in the oak by the Hoffman cabin. But sometimes, when the wind passed through the ridge, it carried a sound like a bell ringing far underground. Some called it haunting, others retribution. But those who studied the valley's soil samples found something else: metallic traces that shouldn't have existed in that layer of rock. Iron, yes, but fused with ash, as if the earth had swallowed what it was forced to remember. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something else. Every map drawn after 1834 shifted Cedar Hollow 3 miles north away from its original location. No one has ever explained why. But the place where the church once stood no longer appears on any record. Because the hollow didn't vanish. It was hidden. In 1835, a year after Cedar Hollow ceased to exist, a single document appeared in the territorial archives of Jefferson City. It was labeled only "Report on the Hoffman Disturbance." No author, no seal, no date. But the language inside was unmistakable, bureaucratic, clinical, and cold. It spoke of religious hysteria, localized famine, and natural causes. Not a word about the Reverend. Not a word about the missing investigator or the burned meeting house. Not a word about the carved symbols found scorched into the oak or the iron fused into soil. The conclusion was simple. Cedar Hollow collapsed under its own superstition. Case closed. But the deeper you dig, the stranger it becomes. By the 1840 census, every name tied to that report, clerks, magistrates, even the surveyors who redrew the maps, had been reassigned, retired, or disappeared. Their families relocated to counties under direct federal jurisdiction. The land itself was reclassified as uninhabitable due to sinkhole activity. Yet geological records show no sign of collapse, only silence. Then there are the letters, smuggled correspondence between 2 officials in St. Louis. One wrote, "The widow's curse has reached the capital. The thing that remembers cannot be buried again." The other replied, "Then we will rename it." That's how the region became known not as Cedar Hollow, but as Iron Valley, a mining zone deeded to a private company whose shareholders traced directly to the same men who once supported Reverend Corwin's ministry. Within a decade, the town's existence faded from every map, every census, every sermon. All that remained was the ore, sold and smelted, scattered across the foundations of a young America. Pieces of the hollow melted into railways and weapons, built into progress itself. And maybe that's the true horror, because if the hollow could remember, perhaps it wanted to spread. Decades later, miners reported hearing bells in the tunnels, echoing where no metal should ring. Some quit, some vanished. One journal entry, dated 1872, reads simply, "The walls whisper her name. The ore is alive." But that, of course, never made it into history books. The Hoffman case became a footnote, a folkloric tragedy of the Ozarks. Still, every researcher who's tried to trace the missing pages of that 1835 report finds the same problem. The files are there, but the ink is gone. Like something erased the words, not from paper, but from memory itself. And that brings us to the question no historian dares ask aloud. If Cedar Hollow was forgotten by design, who designed the forgetting? Because somewhere between faith and government, superstition and science, a hand reached down and turned a true story into legend. And legends are safer. Legends don't remember, but history does. Today, the place called Cedar Hollow doesn't exist. Drive through the Ozarks and you'll find forest, limestone, and silence, nothing more. But locals will tell you that if you stop near mile marker 47 on the old Iron Valley Road and step into the trees, your compass will spin, your watch will stop, and if you wait until dusk, you'll hear it. A single bell tolling from somewhere beneath the ground. Geologists claim the sound comes from trapped air pockets, a quirk of acoustics. Historians say the town's ruins washed away in floods long ago, but there are those who've gone looking and come back changed. In 1974, a University of Missouri research team surveyed the region for iron deposits. Their instruments recorded magnetic anomalies shaped like a perfect circle, nearly half a mile wide. At its center, a void solid stone on every side, but empty space within, like a hollow heart buried in rock. They drilled once, just once. The equipment failed, and their field notes ended with a single phrase scrawled by hand. The ground remembers. No further excavations were attempted. To this day, anyone who enters that forest describes the same sensation. A pressure in the chest, a faint ringing in the ears, a feeling of being watched by something ancient, patient, and aware. The trees lean inward, as if listening. And the soil, when turned over, carries flecks of black metal smooth, cold, untouched by rust. Some say Prudence Hoffman was consumed by the thing she awakened. Others believe she became it, because perhaps the hollow didn't curse her, perhaps it chose her. Every century has its hidden ruins, places scrubbed clean by authority, sanctified by silence. Cedar Hollow is just one of many. And if history is written by the victors, then the forgotten are still writing back, through whatever means they can. Through whispers, through accidents, through places where compasses fail and bells ring beneath the soil. When you hear that sound, when you feel the air shift and the hairs on your neck rise, it isn't superstition. It's memory. And it's asking you one question. What have you buried that still remembers your name? If you've come this far, you already belong to the story. Type it once more in the comments. I remember the hollow, because those who speak it out loud become part of the chain that history cannot erase. And maybe, just maybe, the hollow will remember you kindly when it wakes again. Cedar Hollow was just one town. How many others were rewritten or renamed? Subscribe for the next descent into the archives they tried to burn.